Good afternoon, and welcome to today's presentation by Dallas Hazelhorst. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All audience members are on mute, but you can submit questions through the chat feature. At the conclusion of the presentation, Dallas will answer a few questions as time permits. And now, Dallas, take it away.
Hi, thanks, Rebecca. My name is Dallas Hazelhorst, and I'm an STI master's degree candidate. Today, I'm going to be presenting HL7 data interfaces in medical environments, attacking and defending the Achilles heel of healthcare. HL7 is an essential yet often forgotten component of healthcare IT. It remains a fundamentally flawed, insecure standard used in nearly every medical institution worldwide. This research is actually very near and dear to me, and that sounds funny, but it was surprisingly very many years in the making. Prior to founding an MSP in 2003, I was actually a systems integration specialist for a regional hospital. And that hospital also provided IT support for roughly 40 rural hospitals. Now, one of my responsibilities in that role was to create, maintain, monitor, troubleshoot HL7 interfaces for all of the hospitals that we supported. I admittedly didn't fully comprehend the insecurities of HL7 communications while I was actually in that initial role. In fact, it wasn't until many years later that I realized the errors of our ways, and it was well after I had left that particular position. Fast forward to just a few years ago, and I was consulting on multiple security projects for a large hospital system. The interface analyst resigned, and I was able to fill in until that position was rehired. Now, when I sat down to dig into the environment and kind of get brought up on speed, see what's changed in that time, I was actually appalled to find absolutely nothing had changed in that realm in well over 10 years. And to make matters worse, new systems were actually being implemented via the exact same insecure means. This research also served as a two-part SANS gold paper. I'm going to do my best to condense that research into the window of time that we have, but we do have quite a bit of ground to cover, so we're going to move fairly quick. First, I'll touch on the value of the medical data to criminals. I'll discuss the HL7 standard, what purpose it serves in healthcare, and even look at a sample message at one point. We'll then go into the weaknesses of the standard as well as possible attacks. Now, throughout this presentation, I will discuss potential business and patient impacts. And I can't stress that point enough. This is not an attacker phishing a user and installing ransomware. No, don't get me wrong. Ransomware can absolutely cause havoc in a hospital environment, but what we'll see is HL7 insecurities can have far greater impacts. I'll go over some of the practical ways to defend HL7 and also correlate those with the discussed attacks. Another theme here, and it's kind of the last point on the slide, is the realization that insecure healthcare data affects absolutely everyone. Have you been to the doctor? Have you visited a clinic? Have one of your family members been to the ER? If so, then that personal health information, or PHI, has likely been transmitted as HL7. This is an image from the now defunct darknet marketplace called Alphabay. This image shows stolen healthcare data for sale. On the dark web, criminals can purchase a handful of records or even full patient databases. And really, this should come as no surprise. Healthcare data is highly sensitive, and it's also highly complete in terms of information stored in a single source. With the data contained in a medical record, healthcare essentially becomes an all-in-one stop shop for a wide range of criminal activities. If you're a criminal looking to do identity theft, fake prescription refills, or even gathering data on someone for future extortion or blackmail, healthcare has absolutely everything you need. Common security questions and answers to provide or to protect other online accounts, healthcare has that too. Couple the completeness of the data with the fact that healthcare has been undersecured and overconnected for far longer than any other industry, and you really have what I consider to be the perfect storm. Here's a little food for thought. Clearly, medical records are for sale. A looming question should be, How were these records obtained? One thought might be a web vulnerability. Another person might say, well, that was maybe leaked in an insecure database. These possibilities come to mind because it's what we've seen, it's what we've seen in the news, it's what we're all familiar with, and what these exploits can entail. Throughout this presentation, though, I'd ask that you consider HL7 as yet another possible exploit vector. So what is HL7? HL7, it's not a protocol, but rather a standard. HL7 is a behind the scenes way for data to get from system A to system B. I'd consider it the glue that holds hospitals together because it syncs the data between the HL7 interfaces. And while it can be point to point, in most cases, the messages pass through an interface engine. As you see in the example, the interface engine creates somewhat of a hub and spoke with the interface engine itself in the center green area and ancillary systems all around the outside. Now, at the very top of the picture, you'll see a health information exchange, and I specifically point out a government HIE. And the reason for this is because if your state has an HIE, there is a near certainty that patient data is transmitted via an HL7 interface. The statistic on the slide states that 90% plus of healthcare facilities are using HL7. Honestly, 90% is on the conservative side, and that's because it's hard to get an exact number on how many healthcare facilities are actually using it. First, it flies under the radar for the most part, and it's surprisingly common for smaller facilities to not even recognize that they're using it. I know I've personally seen HL7 interfaces at standalone labs with just a couple of lab techs on hand, and also at clinics with a total of 5 employees. So yeah, that's really, really small in terms of small businesses. Generally speaking, the larger the facility, the more likely they will have systems that both need and require HL7 to keep different systems in sync. There are multiple versions of HL7, but HL7 version 2 is by far the most widely used. Um, it uses the minimal lower layer protocol, or MLLP, and that's then encapsulated by TCP/IP. A few other important items to keep in fact. The example in the picture on the slide there, it's very simple, and and a single large facility can actually have hundreds of HL7 interfaces. Also, a single patient can generate hundreds of HL7 messages on a single day. And that may sound really odd, but if you think about it, I mean, all the patients that can be seen in a hospital, whether it's outpatient or inpatient, and just the sheer number, I mean, you can see how HL7 messages are just kind of flying all over the place. So how is that really possible? To answer the question, it's actually helpful to know what triggers an HL7 message. ADT messages are sent for admissions, discharges, and transfers, but of course, there's more reasons to send an actual message than just those 3 items. In fact, there's over 50 message types just for ADT messages. So you can also have ADT messages sent for updating insurance information, changing phone numbers, updating an address, moving to a new room, discharging a patient, canceling a patient discharge. I mean, any number of reasons. Also, you have HL7 messages being sent for orders. So whether it's a lab order or a radiology order, also order results for those orders, getting the results back, billing, scheduling, and just much, much more can be a reason for an HL7 message. So this is the anatomy of an HL7 message, and that was a little medical pun for you. This happens to be an order message, but really the structure of HL7 messages have a similar feel as you go from one message to the next, regardless of what the actual purpose is. So don't let your eyes glaze over here. The text is small, and I apologize for that, but I felt it was important for everyone to see an actual HL7 message, because I don't want someone or anyone to think that HL7 is some magical unicorn that keeps medical facilities running. At the end of the day, it's just text and delimiters. In this particular example, you'll see fields separated by pipes, and then those fields are then further separated by components that are using carets. This is by far the most common setup, and that's because it's the default for HL7. So if we look at some of the more significant items in the message, even if you've never seen an HL7 message, you can likely pick out the information whether I highlighted it for you or not. For instance, in the red there, you'll see the first and last name of the patient, and that's in the PID segment, which is the patient identifier. You see in the yellow, you have the birth date. In dark green, you have the city, state, and zip code along with the address. The maroon, you have the phone number for the patient. Dark blue is the email address. Purple is the ever-present social security number. The light blue is the location of the birth city for that patient. And then down below, you'll see I have highlighted in light green the allergies and reactions. And those are AL1 or allergy segments. And these will become important as we discuss some of the potential attacks here a little bit. Now, you'll also remember from the previous slides reference that I spoke about the common security questions, though it's not shown here just for brevity's sake. It's not uncommon to have old phone numbers, old addresses next to kin, as well as their related information, mother's maiden name, employer information. I mean, sure, we don't have, your first vehicle or your first boyfriend or girlfriend's name or your high school mascot, but you can get the idea and get a sense for how this information could be leveraged for common security questions. Now, worth noting here, I referenced the Mirth product several times throughout the upcoming slides. This is in no way a slight at Mirth, or am I singling them out? I really like Mirth. I actually prefer it to many other interface engine products, and Mirth it's an open source, it's freely available, and it works ridiculously well. That said, all HL7 products and every healthcare vendor who relies on HL7 has the exact same issues that I'm going to describe. And the issue is with the actual HL7 standard and its lack of security, not any particular product or vendor. This is an example interface configuration on the slide. I use an interface engine for both the sender as well as the receiver. In most cases, an interface engine would be either the sender or the receiver, and another hospital system would be on the opposite end. On the left-hand side, highlighted with the red arrows, you'll see that the interface is configured to send to port 6661 on IP address 10.0.0.127. On the right-hand side, the listener opens port 6661, so it's ready to receive data. Now, the big question is what's missing from this overall picture? And if your answer was anything along the lines of, any usernames, passwords, any sort of encryption, any sort of certificates, keys, then you are absolutely spot on. Now, to most every security professional, this should sound vaguely familiar, and that's because there are numerous similarities to Telnet, FTP in regards to clear text transmission of data. Now, for many InfoSec professionals, their hair is on fire at simply finding Telnet or FTP on a network, never mind, any sort of context to what that's found in relation to. Alarms go off on nearly every vulnerability scanner if an open FTP port is found on a network, even if it's for a printer. So how is a standard HL7 configuration any different? Well, first of all, HL7 doesn't bother with those usernames and passwords like those other quote unquote insecure protocols. In addition, there's a good chance that the device or the server with an open FTP or Telnet doesn't transmit some of the most sensitive data on the planet as HL7 does. There are several ways HL7 can be attacked, and denial of service just happens to be one of them that I looked into with this research. At the top, you'll see some other items available on the TCP listener configuration. These are the options that would be right below the port config from the previous slide. We're specifically looking at the default max connections of 10 and the default option to keep connections open. With these defaults in place, the top dashboard here shows the listener sitting in an idle state, meaning there are currently no connections. With just the IP address and the port of the listener, An attacker can perform a denial of service by maxing out the number of connections using just a simple bash one-liner in netcat. In the bottom dashboard picture, you'll see the listener is now maxed out at 10 connections, which means no other systems can send messages to it at this point in time. This would prevent all of those systems from staying in sync at that point. As we saw previously, an HL7 receiver is just a TCP listening port. Thus, if an attacker knows the HL7 message structure, nothing would stop them from sending messages from another unauthorized system on the network. In addition, you could easily modify the text in Notepad or some other text editor and then send the data to the listening system. Assuming your message is properly formatted, the receiving system will process it just as it would a standard message. In the picture, you'll see Smart HL7 Message Sender. It's a free program used to test HL7 interfaces. It allows you to load up an HL7 message and send it to the IP and port of your choosing. As you'll see in the smaller blue box below, the message was acknowledged by the receiver, which means it was received and it's now setting on its queue for processing. The free software can send any HL7 message, so whether it's an ADT, order, result, you name it, it can send all of those. This would include discharging all patients in a hospital, which would be really an elaborate type of denial of service that would significantly disrupt hospital operations. An attacker could also change a patient's weight prior to the prescription of a weight-based drug, which could have some potentially lethal side effects. And really, there are endless possibilities on what an attacker could do in this particular situation. Performing man-in-the-middle on standard HL7 traffic is easy, and there are numerous tools to do it. In the picture, an attacker performs an ARP spoofing attack that redirects traffic, and more importantly, HL7 traffic between the interface engine and lab system. Now, keep in mind, ARP spoofing can redirect traffic between other network devices as well. So it doesn't just have to be those two systems sitting side by side. It could be, with a network device that's sitting in between those, a switch or anything like that. An attacker could use this to gather HL7 messages for future sale, as we saw in the Alpha Bay marketplace. Someone with man-in-the-middle could also modify HL7 messages in real time. Once again, an attacker's creativity, for lack of a better word, is really the only limiting factor in these attacks. There are several ways to perform ARP spoofing from a command line. Surprisingly, there are several ways to perform ARP spoofing from a GUI as well. EtherCap happens to be able to do both, and that's actually what I focused on in some of my research. The graphical version of this software is literally point and click to select targets and then perform the ARP spoofing attack. Because HL7 is clear text, the information is easily readable. The bottom image shows a captured HL7 message on the left-hand side. On the right is the acknowledgement message, which is handy as it provides a little context to the conversation. And, it really looks very similar to that other tool that was used specifically for testing HL7 interfaces in that regard. Once EtherCap establishes a man-in-the-middle position, it also has some additional features such as applying custom filters to modify traffic on the fly. On the slide, you can see what one of those filters might look like. Whether you've done coding before or not, it's really easy to read through the filter and understand what it's doing. The filter is looking for TCP traffic on port 6661. If it finds traffic there, matching that port and TCP, it then searches within the data for mouse, which happens to be the last name of the patient from our earlier example. If it finds a match, it replaces any occurrence of penicillin with sushi, and then replaces the text anaphylactic shock with hives. Basically, the penicillin allergy and potentially fatal outcome is replaced with the sushi allergy producing hives. Keep in mind, these critical pieces of information weren't removed from just one HL7 message, but rather all HL7 messages, as long as this filter and man-in-the-middle is in place. Now, this is an important point in case you missed it. Anaphylactic shock is an extreme and potentially life-threatening allergic reaction that was removed from the medical record for this patient. The penicillin allergy was also removed, so these seemingly minor modifications could drastically change all future drug orders during a hospital visit for this patient. This would also prevent any alert messages or any sort of checks and balances that a nurse might receive if a patient were allergic to a specific drug and then were attempting to order that drug. Now, hospitals could potentially test for this activity, but really, why would they assume that this data was incorrect? What's the difference between this and, say, a legitimate modification because someone previously input the wrong data? And what about the thousands of other allergy potentials that are available? You could also check with the patient before administering every single drug, but that's not really possible from an efficiency perspective. And what about, if you think of a healthcare worker trying to verify the drug allergies with a patient, what about an unconscious patient who is just in a car accident in need of immediate attention? That's just not possible. So HL7 on life support, and I've officially met my medical quota pun limit. Many folks are probably thinking, well, we'll just rip out HL7. It's not needed anymore. Let's just go to something different. Unfortunately, that's just not possible. Without real pushing, prodding industry movement, HL7 is going to be here for quite a few more years. First, what are the alternatives? Well, FHIR is an HL7 replacement. It's billed as an HL7 replacement. FHIR stands for the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. Now, one of the problems with FHIR is that many vendors actually don't support it, even though it's been around for a little bit. And also keep in mind that numerous established vendors in healthcare already have built HL7 interfaces ready to drop into new environments. So we're not just talking about the interfaces that were being built tomorrow or anything else. They're building out these interfaces for well into the future. Also, in many cases, there really aren't any benefits to making that change. HL7 version 2 has been around since 1989. And what that means is that it's changed drastically over the years to meet the ever-changing needs of healthcare. Another fun tidbit about FHIR is that encryption actually is not required. And let me repeat that if you missed it. Encryption is not required. In fact, in a recent public post from the FHIR working group, while discussing encryption, it specifically states, quote, where secure HTTP communications are needed. In other parts of the standard, it states TLS SSL should, and I repeat, should be used for all production data. Now, I have no doubt that some implementers will do the right thing and use encryption. However, I'm guessing many more will see it as an additional step that really they just don't need to mess with. This goes back to the common misconception that we see time and time and time again, is that the internal network is trusted, so really there's no need to secure the data that stays local, so to speak. What about existing legacy HL7 interfaces? Yes, the standard is simple, technically speaking, but anyone who's done a ton of data parsing knows how incredibly tedious it is to get the data to line up properly. And honestly, that's HL7 in a nutshell. Some larger, more complex interfaces can be multi-month or even multi-year projects by the time everything's configured and tested. So really, that leaves us with the option that is to improve the security of existing interfaces and also the current HL7 standard. So as important as it is for me to discuss why an attacker would want to target medical data and even the attack vectors they might use, it would be a huge disservice, in my opinion, to not talk about the ways to protect against these attacks. So as you're looking at the list of potential ways to defend, you'll notice that the first three options are all crossed out. I discussed them in the research. I won't discuss them here. Needless to say, they all have some of their own shortcomings. That said, even the obvious remaining options have their own set of issues. For example, VPNs are probably the most common way that I've seen to protect HL7 interfaces. That said, the only time they are typically used is when that data is sent off-site or over the internet, such as an HIE, whether government or not. The problem with this approach is that no one really pays attention to where the data is actually encrypted at. Does the data travel kind of over the river and through the woods before it actually hits the point of encryption? And that's kind of the big question on VPNs. Network segmentation is often used as a means of protection on more recently implemented interfaces. When done properly, this actually can work and work quite well. However, many interfaces were implemented many years ago, and the very nature of an HL7 interface engine is to communicate with everything. And what that means is interface engines were often installed on what I call a common network segment with everything else, and everything else includes users a lot of times, unfortunately. Very few, if any, organizations are going to go back and re-architect a working solution for the sole purpose of security. Network segmentation can also have issues as network equipment would still have complete visibility of the HL7 data. Another option to protect HL7 messages is SSH tunneling, and I'll admit I'm a huge fan of this. It encrypts the data before sending it over the network. It also ensures the data is not modified in transit, as we kind of showed earlier with the EtherCap example. The beauty of SSH tunneling is that once that passwordless SSH tunnel is established, the only other change is on the sending host. Now, this is important because the underlying HL7 interface configurations are not modified otherwise. As shown in the picture on the upper right-hand side, changing the remote address to localhost redirects the traffic over the SSH tunnel instead. The picture on the lower right shows how SSH tunneled traffic differs from a standard HL7 interface. And as you see, the red is actually showing the unencrypted data, and on the one where it's showing the SSH tunneling, notice the red data never actually leaves the host in question. If both the sending and receiving systems are Unix, Linux, this configuration is really trivial, as most installs do have SSH enabled by default. In my research, I also tested this configuration with Windows PowerShell SSH, and it worked beautifully. The other bonus to the SSH tunneling approach is that other than implementation time, the solution is free, and there are really no associated software costs to implementing it. If something doesn't change, the insecurity of HL7 will be a topic for discussion well into the future. It could also easily become a footnote to future breach statistics. That is, of course, assuming that it's identified as a contributing factor in a breach, which honestly is pretty unlikely. You should now understand the issues with HL7 and the different ways to protect HL7 data. As we've already discussed, insecure healthcare data really does affect everyone. Now, my challenge to you is this. If you work in healthcare, take a look at your HL7 interfaces and see if there are ways that you can improve the security. If you are a healthcare security consultant, identify HL7 traffic as part of your risk matrix. If you pen test in healthcare, get domain admin as you normally would, but with one minor change. While you're there, grab some HL7 data and add it into your report. I'd love to hear stories about whether domain admin or HL7 data gets a healthcare CISO more fired up. HL7 is a glaring hole that gets overlooked time and time and time again. We all need to work together to raise awareness and improve security. I've included my contact information at the bottom. If you have a question about this research or anything else, including some of my blog articles, feel free to contact me. I'll make these slides available on my Linux Included website. Both papers in their entirety are on there in addition to the SANS reading room. And if you're interested, Linux Included also has some sample HL7 message PCAPs available for download for anyone really who wants to play around with the data and more importantly, further some of this research. I appreciate your time and have a great day.